Everyone knows Chicago's the freight capital of the entire world. I don't know why you think Chattanooga is. It's not. Why are we even having a debate about this? Let's put this to bed. Chicago versus Chattanooga. Everyone knows it's Chicago. That's the birthplace of the logistics industry. You're going down, Craig.
Welcome to Full Speed Ahead. I'm Craig Fuller, here with Sander Toth of River Transport News. Sander, you've been around the barge industry for many, many years. You understand how that market works. It's an industry that doesn't get a lot of coverage in the broader media, as well as just in freight. What makes this industry attractive to you, and why is it special?
Well, the industry is rather unique because it's a huge part of the U.S. transportation network. If you ever take a look at a map of the United States, you will see rivers extending from New Orleans up to Chicago, up to the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Louisville, all the way up to Pittsburgh. And all of these major metropolitan areas are connected by an integrated river network. And so you could move product all over these areas independently and largely invisibly. And, you know, people in the real world who drive trucks and cars and commute here and there never see it. But it's a phenomenal network that moves over 600 million tons of products every year, both liquid and dry.
Yeah, it's core to a lot of the parts of the economy are very dependent upon the barge industry, particularly in the commodity sector. Coal is certainly one of the biggest drivers of demand in the barge industry, but that's on decline. How is that impact shaping up?
It hasn't been good, obviously. When you go from a situation where you're moving 160 million tons of coal to power generators in the U.S., and now we've got natural gas prices so low that you're closing coal plants in the middle of the coal fields because they're not competitive. We're now moving less than 90 million tons of coal on the river. And that's had a couple of serious impacts. Number one, obviously, coal is moved in an open hopper, so there's a big surplus of open hopper equipment. But what has resulted also is that some of the better quality open hoppers have been re-equipped with covers. And so they've shifted into covered service. So they're now moving grain and cement and other weather-sensitive commodities. And so it's had a very significant adverse impact on those markets as well, because there's excess capacity in the grain side as well now.
Now, it's all predominantly bulk commodities that are moving through barges. Is there any movement other than between, say, Puerto Rico and the United States, these movements for Jones Act purposes? Is there ever container movement on barges?
There are containers coming out of St. Louis going down to New Orleans, Baton Rouge. I think there's containers out of Memphis going down to New Orleans, Baton Rouge. The two companies that are doing it that I'm aware of are Osprey Line, which is a unit of Kirby Corporation, and SCF Marine, which is a unit of Secor Holdings. SCF Marines is a rather interesting one. They're bringing down empty containers from St. Louis to the Port of Baton Rouge, and at the Port of Baton Rouge, they're loading them up with plastic pellets and then barging them down to New Orleans, where they're then put on a container vessel and shipped overseas.
Got it. What's happening with the broader economy? We're moving from economy where free trade and open borders are a function of how our supply chains work, to more disruptions with trade policy. How is that impacting the barge industry?
It's had a positive and a negative impact. Now, let me say on the positive side, what we've seen prior to the current trade tariff regime and the trade wars that are going on is that we've seen a very substantial decline in the U.S. steel industry and the primary aluminum industry, both of which are fairly heavily reliant on barge transportation for their raw materials. So this decline was not particularly good. So in the last couple of years, we've seen a fairly substantial rebound in demand for steel raw materials. We've seen announcements by Nucor and Big River Steel and SDI, big steel manufacturers, and even U.S. Steel, that they're building new steel capacity. It's all electric arc furnace capacity, new technology, but still they're building new capacity which will generate demand for pig iron and other raw materials, all of which comes in by barge through the Port of New Orleans. So that's a very good thing. Same with the aluminum industry. We've had aluminum plants that were shut down that have now restarted. And again, they bring all their alumina up by barge from the Gulf Coast. Alcoa in Warwick, Indiana, and you've got a couple in Western Kentucky that are doing it now. And so that's been a very positive development for the barge side. On the negative side, we've had a fairly significant impact on our ag exports, particularly soybeans. China is the biggest soybean importer in the world. They account for about 60% of all international soybean trade. And when they decide that they're going to put pressure on the U.S., they're going to put pressure on farmers in Iowa who vote in the Iowa caucuses, and that's what they did. They put basically prohibitive tariffs on U.S. soybeans, and they're using soybeans as a carrot and a stick to move trade negotiations along. So it's had an adverse impact on barge demand, no doubt.
Now, barges are huge in Europe. They represent about a third of the traffic and transportation in continental Europe, but we've not seen that in the U.S. Why is that the case?
I think they've not, in Europe, I guess they've had a longer time to develop their networks, but I'm not sure if they, we've been talking about container on barge. We've pretty much maxed out what we can do on the bulk side, so the next area of obvious growth is containers. And the issue's always been gathering containers and moving them to where they need to be and developing the appropriate front haul, back haul movements. And that's been a very slow process. I can remember going to meetings in the 1980s with organizations such as the Third Coast Coalition, with the inland rivers being the third coast. Nothing's ever really developed with it, and we're still taking infant steps, and I can't explain why. It's people will say we're not spending enough money on port infrastructure to handle containers, and I don't think that's necessarily the issue. I think there are things that are so well entrenched with respect to current container movements that it's a hard sell to say, hey, why reinvent the wheel and move to another mode here?
Yeah, trucking is efficient. Rail is relatively efficient in terms of moving containers.
It is, and if time is not a sensitive commodity for you in terms of what you're moving, then barge is okay. But if you're trying to move things in a timely manner, you may want to go somewhere else.
Yeah, and this year the rivers have been high, a lot of flooding along the river basin, shut down some of the rivers. What has that been like for the operators?
It's been a nightmare for the operators in that we've had 2 successive years where we've had rivers seriously adversely impacted by flooding and high waters for more than 3-4 months, 6 months at a time. And it's had impacts, not just for the barge operators. The impact on the barge operators is obvious. Everything slows down, things get shut down, barges get parked. But it's also had an impact on everybody else who moves product in and out of New Orleans, because when you have a lot of high water and fast moving currents, you have shoaling on the lower Mississippi River. So you can't bring vessels in either that are loaded beyond whatever, 40 feet. If you're loaded to 45 feet and suddenly there's shoaling, and the shoaling happens within 24 hours, you're going to have vessels sitting off in the Gulf Coast for days or even weeks until they can dredge that out. It doesn't matter if they're hauling coal, grain, steel, or containers. It's been a serious problem, and this was something that was going on for 6 months this year.
Yeah, I know in Tennessee, the Tennessee River was shut down for many weeks.
Right.
They've since reopened it. We haven't had the rains that we've had. Climate change is obviously driving a lot of the fluctuations in the weather. Do you see this becoming a bigger issue in the next decade or over the next decade?
No.
You think it's just a cyclical issue?
Yeah, I've seen high waters, I've seen low waters. It's not becoming necessarily any more frequent. You need to give me some real statistical evidence of that. But rivers flood.
Yeah.
Rain happens.
Right. What do you think is the biggest issue, if you were talking to folks that are both shippers and providers, what is the biggest thing that's top of mind for them?
There are short-term issues and then there are longer-term issues. Obviously, the longer-term issue is this economic expansion. For the barge industry, what the barge industry relies on is ag output, agricultural output, and agricultural traffic, and output from basic heavy industry manufacturing. So anything that is positive for domestic manufacturing is a positive thing for the barge industry. So whether it's energy production, whether it's steel manufacturing, cement production, construction, that's all good. And they're worried. We were in a period of very low and stagnating manufacturing growth for a lot of years now, and that we finally started breaking out of that in 2016, and I think they want to see that continue. On the near-term side, the thing that drives the barge industry is the agricultural cycle at the margin. And so, what's going to happen now this year with our corn crop and soybean crop, and what's going to happen next spring when the South Americans harvest their corn and soybean crop. Those are the things that everybody watches at this point.
Yeah. Fascinating conversation. Barges, I live above the gorge, and I can see the barge traffic transverse the gorge. It's I love watching the boats right at sunset. Enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for coming into Freight Alley.
My pleasure. Thank you, Craig.
Great conversation, talking about freight all kinds, really exploring the intersection of how all modes of traffic impact one another. If we're going to dive into this at FreightWaves Live, if you haven't got tickets, get them today at freightwaves.com/events. You can find out. FreightWaves Live is on November 12th and 13th in Chicago. We'll see you there.